Welcome to the Venezuela Analysis Podcast. I'm your host, José Luis Granado Ceja. The Venezuela Analysis Podcast brings you independent, on-the-ground, English-language coverage of Venezuela and the Bolivarian process. You'll hear news and in-depth analysis about the country, as well as coverage of leftist and grassroots forces. And on today's program, I have the honor of being joined by fellow staff writer Cira Pascual Marquina, as well as Chris Gilbert, who are going to be joining us to talk about a very special issue that they are the co-editors of, Monthly Review, which gets into the Commune. We love talking about the Commune here at Venezuela Analysis, and who better to talk about this than two individuals who have spent an extraordinary amount of time living, working, collaborating on projects together with communards, with communal organizations, with the actual communes in Venezuela, but not just in Caracas, but in the countryside. So I feel like we have an extraordinary privilege of being able to converse with them about this and to talk about this very special issue, which, to be honest, when I saw that it was coming out, Cira, you did me the favor of sending it over to me. I got so excited because these are precisely the kinds of questions that I think are so relevant given what we're living through in this historical moment at a global scale, not just Venezuela, not just Latin America, but the world. These really important interventions that I think have to happen given how imperialism is operating here in 2025. And of course, rescuing what is in a lot of ways the best about what is the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, which is the communes. So before I go on for too much longer, I do want to give a chance here to welcome our two guests. Cira, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm well. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's really good always to have these conversations with you. I really enjoy them.
And Chris, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thanks, Jose Luis. I'm glad to be back. I think this is my second participation in a podcast of yours.
Yes, absolutely. And it's always good to have you as well. On a personal basis, I am a fan of your writing as well. It's very useful. When I saw the headline of the story that we actually ended up rerunning on VenezuelaAnalysis.com, I had a little tinge of jealousy because this is the kind of stuff I wish I was able to work on and write. But of course, we do have you here to have this conversation. And I wanted to start with a very simple conversation, which is, the theme, the framework of this issue of Monthly Review is the communes. Can you explain why you gave it this title, Communes in Socialist Construction? Chris, we'll start with you.
Sure. The title was an attempt to provide context. We've done a lot of work on communes in Venezuela. In this case, we wanted to emphasize, and this reaches to other themes that I think we'll talk about in the program. We wanted to emphasize communes as part of a project of socialist transition, and also as part of a project of national liberation. I've always liked Victorian-style titles like Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Origin and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, these long titles that are actually highly explanatory. You feel like you don't need to read the book after you read the full title. And so I would have preferred to even give a longer title mentioning the question of national liberation. I think that points to the overall emphasis we wanted to give in this multi-authored issue, which was on the broader context in which communes can function. So questions like strategy, questions like integration into a national project were central. And that's, of course, part of our own contributions to the issue. But you can also see it in, for example, Utsa and Pravat Patnaik approach the question of communes, but within a broader framework of the worker-peasant alliance. Or, in fact, the contribution related to China deals with some of the existing communes or communal projects in China, but considers them within the larger framework of a return to communal governance in the Chinese countryside. So throughout the issue, you'll see an emphasis on context. And I guess one of the things that I feel is that we ourselves have looked at communes in a way that sometimes puts a lot of emphasis on how the communes function internally. For example, how they can overcome capitalist exploitation. Obviously, in a commune, you can have communal exchange of activities rather than commodities, and that overcomes the law of value in a great measure. You can also, there's the hope of overcoming different forms of oppression, racial oppression, patriarchal oppression in this kind of micro context. But at the same time, it's overwhelmingly clear that a commune is not going to contribute to socialism if it's not part of a broader strategic project. And especially in a world in which the primary contradiction is so evidently the contradiction with imperialism, it has to be part of a broader anti-imperialist framework. So I think these are some of the issues that guided our decision to emphasize context, emphasize strategy, emphasize the conditions in which a communal project actually represents a viable socialist and anti-imperialist strategy.
And in fact, to quote from that article that I was mentioning, Socialist Communes and the Anti-Imperialism, the Marxist Approach, you say, interestingly enough, it is very common. In fact, one of the clearest expressions of Eurocentrism among intellectuals is to hastily declare processes of change in the global South over and done with whatever to encounter the smallest setback. In the eyes of mainstream intellectuals, such processes are forever spiraling downward, as demonstrated by the chorus of expert voices, always ready to declare the end of a cycle or the ebbing of the latest progressive tide. That line really jumped out at me, and it actually brings me to my question that I have for you, Cira, around what is the Commune? In this issue, you have this interview with Angel Prado. He's a founder of the El Maizal Commune in central western Venezuela, a key leader of the Communal Union. We've had several programs here on the podcast talking about the Communal Union. So I thought we could start there in defining what a Venezuelan commune is, given this tendency elsewhere to want to write things off, to say, oh, Venezuela is off the path or everything is coming to an end, when really we have this incredible example of what really existing socialism can start to look like in the case of communes in Venezuela. Cira, take it away.
So, yes, we have this interview with Angel Prado, who is first and foremost a communal, but also the Minister of Communes. And actually, I wanted to read a small quote that actually encapsulates, it's a very good synthesis in terms of what he says, how he explains what a commune is. He says, a commune is a grassroots organization with a specific within a specific territory where self-government is established with a political structure that legislates, administers resources, and manages its own means of production. And I think that if they ask you to give a definition of what a Venezuelan commune is, that would, in very few words, that would be the best definition that I could find. Now, since that's very compressed, I think it's good to go a little bit in depth and understand a little bit what it is. Well, basically, the commune is the space, it's a territorial space. It's like a community where people self-organized in order to reorganize social relations from the territory. So revolutionary organizations can be class-based organizations in the factory, or they can be like a feminist, anti-patriarchal organization. Those are sectorial organizations. A party is obviously not territorial. The Revolutionary Party will have a non-territorial base to it. But communes have a territorial base to them. And this is important because actually the composition of the working class in Venezuela, of course, the working class suffers the exploitation and oppressions of capitalism, and specifically in the periphery. But one thing that's important to understand about Venezuela is that the working class is generally not deployed to a work center, to say a factory. It is not intensively together in a workspace. So Venezuela has a rentier economy. It's a capitalist rentier economy. And this means that a lot of the population is actually surplus population. It's not directly involved in the production of goods and services. And jobs, the space where people materially reproduce their life, are very precarious and not organized as they are, say, in a German factory or even in a Mexican maquila, in a US-owned Mexican maquila. This generates a certain condition for the Venezuelan working class, which is important to understand. That the working class suffers, of course, the forms of oppression, domination, and exploitation that are of capitalism, that are desplegado, that are thrown out by capitalism, that are imposed by capitalism. But the working class is not necessarily unified in one space, in one factory, etc. That means that it is actually the barrio, the campo, those are the places where the working class concentrates and can organize. That's why that's one reason why the commune, which I believe may be a roadmap for socialism, not only in Venezuela, but I think that that's one reason why specifically in Venezuela, the roadmap commune has become so important. So that is the first thing to understand about the commune. And then there's another very important thing to understand about the commune. The commune walks over two legs, we could say. If you imagine the commune as an integral body, it walks over two legs. Direct participative and protagonic democracy, substantive democracy, but substantive democracy is absolutely nothing if you do not have the means of production. So an assembly is a space for collectively deciding what an assembly in a communal council, which is the first level of the commune. In the assembly, you decide what problems you have, how to solve them collectively, all that. That is very important, actually. I should not say that that's not important. But actually, you are not transforming the social relations of property at that level if you do not have the means of production, if you still have to sell your capacity to work to the bourgeoisie. So the important thing about the commune is that one of the legs is democracy, substantive democracy, which walks hand in hand with collective property over the means of production. Propiedad social directa comunal. Direct social property is what defines the form of property that Chavez defined that would be central to the making of new social relations. Now, I should add that today, as we see a growth of communes, we should also acknowledge that most communes do not have yet means of production on their own control. But the ones that have it, what does direct social property mean? That it's not private property, of course, it's not state property, it's not cooperative property. The property is the property of the means of production is in the hands of the whole community, and as such, the community decides what to do with the surplus, how to produce, and what to do with the surplus. And this is key to understanding in full what the communal project is about. It's not only about people sitting around in a circle and taking decisions together, but it's also about materially building an alternative to capitalism.
I want to dive back into some of the conversations that I think this latest issue of Monthly Review provokes for us. But before we do that, I do want to jump in on one thing here, which is, there's a mention in this interview about the change that we've seen. Even though here at Venezuela Analysis, we've been talking about communes since El Golpe de Timón and beforehand, actually, there was definitely a moment where even the Minister Prado acknowledges that there was more tension than there was synergy. And now we've kind of gone through a cycle where it's gone from tension to synergy. Can you help us explain why that is the case in Venezuela today? What does it have to do with the communal project and the broader anti-imperialist struggle that does take place in Venezuela given current conditions?
I'll go very quickly on that. Basically, when the blockade came about, the government had to assume a relatively pragmatic policies. The situation was really dramatic, and pragmatic decisions in a capitalist society. Chavez would remind us once and again that Venezuela was still had a capitalist economy. Pragmatic decisions in a capitalist economy are going to be liberalization of the economy, basically. There's two things. So there was a tremendous pressure. And actually, I suspect that imperialism did have as one of its objectives the intention of generating a normalization in capitalist terms of the economy. So that did happen, but with liberalization of the economy doesn't go very well hand in hand with the communal project, which is an anti-capitalist project. It defines an anti-capitalist horizon. So in those years, there were actually frictions between the communal movement and the government. Of course, the communal movement always understood that the government was an anti-imperialist government and never put as an objective, never broke with the government. There were frictions, but there was never, absolutely ever a rupture. But as it turns out, I would say that it is precisely in the communes where the Chavista, we could say, revolutionary reserve exists. And it was communards themselves, it was the people in the barrios and in the campo who, around 2016, 2017, while there was this process of liberalization of the economy because of the US blockade, it was the working people of Venezuela who turned towards the communes. I always say this, but I think it's just it's the best way to tell it. In 2012, Chavez had said commune or nothing. In 2016, 2017, there was actually nothing in Venezuela. No medicines, no food, no gas, no nothing. And the working people of Venezuela, not everybody of course, but some people in the most organized communities turned to the commune. Commune or nothing, they go to the commune. So communes began to emerge in that moment, in a very, very difficult moment, in an autonomous, we could say in a relatively autonomous way. And the communes begin to show that in the commune, there's not only a reserve, a political revolutionary reserve, but there is also ways of addressing everyday problems of people outside of the logic of capital. So I would say that it is because communes, I'm sorry, I would say that it is because communes have shown that from the communal project, you can actually give a more efficient answer to the needs of the people today. So I'm saying not only do communes project a light over a better future, but today already communes are capable of giving answers to the very intense needs of the Venezuelan people. The government did this, and the government began to turn towards the commune. So it's a correction on the government's part. And I could say too that there was a process of correction on the communal movement, because at some point within the communal movement, there may have been too critical a position in terms of the government, in terms of the government's liberalization of the economy. In other words, it is probably true that the government had no option but to liberalize the economy. But at that time, I would say most of the communal movement did not have the tools to understand that. And in retrospect, we have come to understand that we do not celebrate it. The liberalization of the economy is something that should not be celebrated and that we have to overcome. But we have to understand it in the context of the war without bombs that Venezuela has been living over the last 10 years.
Appreciate you being able to kind of move us through these different periods, these different kinds of moments in this relationship between the communal movement, the communes themselves, and the state. And actually brings me to my question, is that both of you have this really long trajectory of investigating the communal project, seeing it go through different phases, making corrections, self-criticism, all the rest of it. But I wanted to ask, to return to this new issue of Monthly Review, what does this issue bring that is new to the conversation around communes?
Well, I would say that one thing that it gave us a chance to was to broaden the horizon a bit. I mean, essentially, we could invite other contributors from other places in the world. And that's exactly what we did. For example, I mentioned the contribution that essentially draws on the Indian context by the Patnaiks. There's also a contribution that deals with contemporary China. And you could say that, for example, Salvador Engel de Maure, his contribution looks at the USSR and Hungary, or that's the focus of his studies. So it was a chance to look beyond Venezuela. And I think, to me, there's an important theoretical point to be made there, which is that partly as an unfortunate legacy of postmodernism, there was, or different tendencies postmodern type tendencies that emerged in from the 1970s forward. There's a tendency to treat projects or efforts in different countries as irreducibly unique. And then as a consequence, so each one is kind of a solipsistic entity and there can be no comparison and they don't have shared problems. And then the whole notion of anything universal or even general gets thrown out the window. And that is obviously false. For example, if you look at a project of socialist construction, wherever it takes place in the world, it will confront some very basic problems of capitalism. And it will confront most likely basic problems of imperialist domination. So essentially there is a great common territory. There's an unfortunate habit, or you could say a necessary habit in projects such as the Venezuelan one or Arab social, I'm even using the word right now, to construct an Arab socialism or an African socialism. And sometimes these terms are politically expedient. Nevertheless, they can't conceal the fact that there are essential questions that each socialist project will have to face concerning the way they organize labor or the way excedents or surpluses are distributed. And that's precisely the points of where there can be points of contact over these very essential issues. So by reaching out in a systematic way, we wanted to, we were able to get this broader horizon on a given question, the role of communes in socialist construction and processes of national liberation. Then there's also the chance to look more profoundly at certain theoretical questions. My own contribution, you could say it's a reconstruction of, those are big words, but a reconstruction of Marx's theory of the communes with a particularly political objective in view. And the same thing applies to John Foster's contribution. John Foster's contribution is in his case, an extremely profound and thorough reconstruction of Marx's view about communal society. And then in terms of getting a more profound view of things, I think Brian Napolitano, who I believe lives in Mexico City with you, he's, I think, one of the people who has the most thorough understanding of Esteban Mesaros's work today. So since Esteban Mesaros is one of the key theorists of the Venezuelan project, in some way he's one of the key theorists of the Venezuelan project of constructing socialism by way of the commune. So I think Brian has a very thorough understanding of Mesaros's work and has a very interesting exploration, particularly in relation to environmental issues. So I should mention that one of the things that when you reach out into the world, we were able to have a more international perspective and look at the larger body of work on communal projects and communal theory. But I should mention that when you reach out in that world, I say it's a jungle because it's full of, often the vast majority of work on communes and communal projects has an anarchist or autonomous slant to it. And that is, I think that some of those contributions are interesting. They focus on the micro element that can be interesting contributions to communal theory, but they're actually disastrous, or quite often disastrous, when they are applied in a real context. And that connects with the Eurocentric issue that you mentioned earlier. We were saying that the Eurocentric viewpoint is everything is always failing in the global South. But by the same token, and the Eurocentric viewpoint always favors anarchist and autonomous theory, precisely because it doesn't deal with the nasty issues of social class or state power, and it can often overlook the question of imperialism. And those issues are the very ones that have to define our thinking. So when we reached out, we were consciously avoiding anarchist and autonomous viewpoints, looking more for efforts to integrate the communal project into a broader system, into projects of national liberation. One of the things that struck me in the course of developing this issue is that I became aware that Angel Prado himself had recovered an idea of Chavez's that I totally passed over. And it was that Chavez, in Ala Presidente Teórico Número Uno, he brought up the Chilean Commune project, this little booklet on the Chilean Commune, which is called Inside a People's Commune. And actually, we reproduced part of that booklet in our issue. But in that, he refers to a national system of communes, and that he said that we would need to create one by 2030. That's an interesting element that I'd forgotten about Chavez, but really points to all the things we were arguing in this issue, that communes need to be integrated into larger projects, that they can't be isolated cells. Chavez himself said in another context that commune is a cell, but a cell needs a body. So this is one of the issues that we want to put forward. And I think it's this exploration of communes. You were asking initially about what is new in this book. This is a non-anarchist, a non-autonomous view of communes. Rather a look at communes, how they can be useful for socialist projects.
And of course, there's also a mention of the MST, the Landless Peasants Movement in Brazil, an interview that you conducted with João Pedro Stelli, which I think is also a very long-standing example, I would say, of this understanding that there is a sort of a very specific site of struggle, in this case, land reform, but in their case, has never been separated from the need to defend a sovereign Brazil in the face of, in particular, of anti-imperialist aggression. Cira, I don't know if you wanted to share some of your thoughts on what this brings to the table that is so necessary given the world historic moment that we're living in.
Basically, I will be very brief. I mean, there is a tendency when people look at communes to look at them, to idealize them oftentimes, and to not, as Chris was saying, look at them in relation to a whole, a complete relation of the communists with the national and the internationalist project of the working class. So I think that that's the most important thing that we've done. We have worked a fair amount on communes, but it is true that we have generally we have generally dealt with the issue of the commune being actually a national project. But for instance, what Chris has been addressing, which is the commune as an anti-imperialist, how that communes must be, to be revolutionary, must be anti-imperialist. I think that that's something that this issue puts on the table, in addition to the theorization, taking Marx and understanding that the commune is just, of course, it's not an invention because, for instance, we have worked with indigenous communes in Amazonas, and those communities were living in communal organization long before colonization. So in that sense, it's not new. But it is also, in terms of the revolutionary theory of Marxist theory, the commune is not something new. So I think that the issue brings in all those components. So it gives us a richer perspective on it all. And a non-ingenious or simplistic perspective too. I think that those were aims that we have when we went into working this issue about a year or longer ago that we began with it.
And in this article that I mentioned previously, Socialist Communes and Anti-Imperialism, the Marxist Approach, you talk about Marxist theory of the commune. And it's quite interesting because you point out something that I've noticed as well, is almost this insistence on wanting to separate the young Marx from the older Marx, and as if they were representative of completely isolated thinking. And in the article, in fact, you go through the process of showing how there is a continuity between the young Marx and the older, later Marx around the issue and the question of the commune. So Chris, I wanted to ask you, how does the work of this issue of the magazine constitute, in your view, a reconstruction of Marxist theory of the commune?
Well, there are actually two contributions that I would say especially are reconstructions of Marxist theory of the commune. Well, on the one hand, John Bowlby Foster, on the other hand, my own. What is a reconstruction? I mean, why is there a need for a reconstruction? Sometimes it's rather grandiose words. I always think of German Marxologists doing reconstructions of this or that part of Marx. But in fact, a reconstruction is needed in this case, just like Marxist theory of the state. A clear case of a need for a reconstruction of Marxist theory is the state, because Marx does not have a book that says this is how the state works. He perhaps intended to write one, but he didn't. So if you want to have an idea of what Marx thought about the state, you have to go around his work and pick up pieces and try to put them together, reconstruct them into something that's coherent. And I think the same, it's just as obvious and curious. It's curious that both the state and the commune are in this kind of, that they're somewhat symmetrical in Marx. That you have to reconstruct or build up a theory of the commune from quite disparate elements in Marx. Nevertheless, it's relatively continuous. You were saying that one of the polemical things I bring up in my article is just, it's always impressed me. I mean, how people, these naive, or I would say motivated, maybe they're not naive at all, motivated gestures of cutting up Marx. So in the 1960s, people developed the idea that the young Marx was something different, particularly that young Marx was anti-Stalinist. That was one of his most impressive things. And he was more philosophical, more humanist. And then in our time, I think there's been, they do that with the late Marx, or sometimes the last Marx. The last Marx was the community-friendly Marx. And again, it's a little bit like, as we were talking about anarchist theory or autonomous theory, the community-friendly Marx doesn't have to deal with nasty issues like class, and doesn't have to deal with the heavy issues of political economy. But that view of the commune is very problematic. I'm interested, it's interesting in this revival of interest in the last Marx, partly based on new material, or material being put out by MAGA, I forget me, the mega project, would you believe, the Marx Engels the Gesamtwerk. He is the they're publishing Marx's notes and notebooks and on a lot of the materials unpublished, and you have more of a window on Marxist, especially the last or late Marxist work. But some people approach this with a very limited, a strikingly limited set of interests. So, for example, Koei Saito, who's quite an interesting thinker, a Japanese ecologist, it seems like what he draws out of Marx's interest in the commune is just that it's a kind of degrowth communism. So it's a very limited viewpoint. Or at least Kevin Anderson, who's a wonderful writer in many senses, but when he looks at the late Marx's work on the commune, all he can see is that Marx didn't have a unilinear view of development. So when it comes to Reconstruction, I was motivated by a particular concern. As I said, what's the role of a commune in an anti-imperialist struggle? When is a commune part of an anti-imperialist struggle? And when is it not? And there's clear cases, actually horrendous cases of communes not being part of, actually being instrumental to imperialism. The most obvious case in our time was a kibbutz. A kibbutz is a settler colonialist project that's functional to imperialism, absolutely on the wrong side of history. And then, leaving aside these extreme examples of a pro-imperialist commune that a kibbutz would be, you can look at autonomous projects that fail to, or projects that have such an excess of autarky and autonomy that they don't, that they're unable to conjugate with a project of national liberation, or unable to project a project of national liberation. And the non-governmental organizations often work in the same general context. They love to promote communities, communes, precisely because that allows them to avoid issues like land reform, which are always hard, or issues of national sovereignty, which they precisely violate. So motivated by this interest, by this pressing question, when is the communist anti-imperialist, I was forced to do a reconstruction of Marx's view of the commune. And just by posing a simple question, looking at the late Marx and the rest of Marx, especially the Grundrisse, I found that when Marx looks at the commune has most information about is the Russian peasant commune, the Община. He is quite aware of the need for them to be part of a revolution. He says the Russian commune needs the Russian revolution. It will only be saved by a Russian revolution. And that's something that people quite often pass over lightly. So you can see that when Russia was something like a dependent state, what we call a dependent state, it had industry, it was dominated in great measure by French banking. And a lot of the industry was kind of subordinated industry of the same kind that exists in Latin America now. And so Marx is aware of this dependent condition, and he realized that there needs to be a political revolution that will overthrow the existing state and overcome that condition of dependency. So in this case, simply by asking the right question, I was able to reconstruct an important element of Marxist theory of the communes that's often overlooked. And I also look at the Grundrisse, because one thing is interesting in the Grundrisse, again, Eric Hausmann pulled out an interesting section of the Grundrisse, I think it's as early as the 1960s, where he talks about communal forms, 4 different communal forms. But the commune runs throughout the Grundrisse, because even when Marx is talking simply about money, he juxtaposes money and commodity production with communal production. And right in those moments, you can see how Marx, far from isolating the commune, actually he looks at the commune in relation to such a phenomenon as banking, he juxtaposes commodity production and communal production. And then he starts talking about how commodity production leads to banking, monopoly, it leads to the world market, rivalries on the world market. So you can see how he's already projecting what's essentially proto-imperialist phenomenon. So precisely by looking at Marx, the whole of Marx, and reconstructing a coherent vision of the commune based on the whole of Marx's work, you can see how Marx, far from isolating the commune, far from drawing out one aspect, he was completely aware that it needed to be integrated, as Chavez would say, in a national system, a nationwide system that would be direct, that would have a class element to it, that would probably have a party-like leadership, or at least a heavy element of state leadership that would take the communes forward as part of a socialist project that was also a project of national liberation.
I have a couple of more questions for you, and we're almost done here, but I wanted to start my next one with an anecdote. So I actually had a friend who does human rights work in Central America visit here in Mexico City, and we were discussing precisely some of these questions about sort of that dance between an emphasis on community-based struggles and community needs. In particular, in the case of Central America, it's often communities resisting the imposition of mining projects by transnational capital. But of course, as we go through this conversation, reminds me of what we were talking about that night, because I was stressing that the anti-imperialist struggle, which I agree with you, this assertion you made at the beginning, does appear to be, in my view, the primary contradiction, especially given the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, that the anti-imperialist struggle necessarily passes through the state, not exclusively through the state, but it almost seems like sometimes they bend the stick too far the other way, which is that my friend was insisting, no, through community. But I do think that has certain structural limitations in terms of the actual dangers that imperialism presents to us. And then, reading across some of the material in this issue, there was this quote from Angel Prado that I think really kind of sums it up perfectly. And it also made me reflect a lot on what we're living through here in Mexico as well. I'll read it out extensively for you, this quote here, and then I'll jump to my question, which is, so he says, quote, "The choice before us is clear. Either we advance in building socialism, constructing participatory and protagonist democracy while defending our natural resources, or we risk becoming another reformist state with so-called progressive government that fails to transform existing state structures. If we do not advance with our own political model, the one proposed by the Bolivarian Revolution and Chavez, imperialism will destroy us. If we fail to dismantle the structures they imposed upon us, they will destroy everything we have built." And I think that really resonated with me precisely because I do understand, especially as someone who's accompanied Venezuela, but also been an observer of the MST in Brazil, but the process of change in Bolivia, which is also mentioned in this issue, but of course, the fourth transformation here in Mexico. I think really the biggest impediment to any kind of socialist construction in Mexico, even if that isn't the term that's in vogue here, is precisely imperialism. And imperialism will destroy everything we have built if we don't have an understanding. And part of that necessarily passes through grassroots organizations like the Commune, like what we see in Venezuela. And so that brings me to the question. What do you think of the slogan, "Commune or nothing"? Cira, you were talking about how at one point it really was nothing. And in fact, Angel at one point says, despite the pandemic and the rest of it, people still had grassroots organization. I would argue that I think because of all of these systems weighing down upon the people, that there was a turn back to grassroots organization. So to go back to this, what place does this form, the Commune in the case of Venezuela, play specifically now in the anti-imperialist struggle?
I'll be brief about it, and then Chris, I think, will have we also have some interesting thoughts that we were just talking about yesterday. But basically, the slogan "Commune or nothing" is tremendously powerful. I mean, it really has become so much a part of the current moment in the Bolivarian Revolution. It comes back from 2012. We can trace it back to then, but actually, it is right now. For instance, we were just having a visit in El Panal Commune. I'm a commoner there, and we were having an internationalist visit. People from the Basque Country, from Colombia, from Brazil, the MST, from Catalonia. So we had these visits for about 3 or 4 days, and it was really a very wonderful space for exchanging visions and actually for building together. But it actually this cry is not only very powerful amongst us who are building communes here in Venezuela, but it actually is a process. It's a project that becomes very quickly incorporated in the struggles. It is very easily identified because it does this contraposition between what capitalism offers us and what a better world may offer us if we organize. So when we think about it, when we think about it in terms of a Latin American perspective, I will add one more thing. The situation, and I repeat myself, but the situation that the Venezuelan people have lived over the past few years is really very, very terrible, and people should be aware of it. But when you visit communes, which we have been doing, and in Venezuela Analysis we have this series, Communal Resistance, which I encourage everybody who wants to learn about communes to go and read it. It's a series that in the voices of communards, you learn about what they are building and also how they theorized. So I think that when you visit communes, one of the things that we've learned is that people who are building communes, they do not assume themselves as victims, even though they could, because they have suffered a lot and their food and their medicines have been taken away by the imperialist blockade, but actually they assume themselves as subjects of transformation. Of course, the situation of people who live in Venezuela is particularly difficult, like the situation of people who live in Cuba, because of the imperialist blockades. But it is also true that in the global south, and especially in Latin America, everybody faces multiple forms of oppression and domination that are intensified from the situations lived by most people in the global north. So I think that in that sense, the commune has legs here in Latin America. But I would say that it doesn't only have legs in Latin America. I think it has legs around the world. It has legs around, like for everybody who's committed to building a better world. And we are seeing it here in the worst of conditions. But of course, Venezuela is not the only place where communes are being built.
Chris, if you want to jump in on that as well, what place does the commune have in the anti-imperialist struggle? Concretely, let's give this answer to our viewers and listeners.
The commune has an important role that it can play as long as it's integrated into a project of national liberation. It can have a powerful role. You were mentioning the question you were mentioning how the role of the state, and I wanted to say something about that, how that issue came up for you with regard to, specifically with regard to the imperialist pressure, imperialist attacks, and I completely coincide with that. I mean, I think one of the lessons we've all had in the past 2 years is that we've had overwhelming illustrations of what the primary contradiction is. I mean, it's one thing to say the primary contradiction. I remember the Canal 8 VTV used to run series that said imperialism exists. It would try to show that imperialism exists. Well, that was a difficult task. I think that I totally understand the motive of running those little spots on how imperialism exists. But I can say in the last 2 years, we've all had a tremendous, bloody, terrible lesson in how imperialism exists. And like you, I'm thinking principally of the genocidal assault being carried on in Gaza by not only Israel, but the United States going hand in hand in that. At the same time, in a smaller way and a slower way, we've experienced extreme pressures here in Venezuela. I think that what happened in the last summer was extraordinarily powerful lesson. Not only was it that the pressures put on by the support of Maria Corina as we were going into the elections, but also the way much of the northern left abandoned us in the hour of need and defending those of us who, we defend the elections and defend the government. So that the polarization became all the more evident. And that's precisely why the question was raised, what is the role of the commune in an anti-imperialist struggle? And I think I've given my answer to that. But I think with the same spirit, I feel like slogans need to be often modified, or at least modified in the way we understand them. And the Commune or Nada slogan is a powerful slogan. You could say it belongs in one of the great treasures of the Bolivarian process. Many people understand it to be Chavez's dying words, essentially, though they're not. And curiously, another memorable statement, when Chavez's actually last public words to Venezuelan people, he did not mention communes, I believe. He did not even mention socialism. He said, ahora tenemos patria. So I think it's between those two things. It's, commune or nada, but manteniendo la patria. And I think that, so that's why I think it's useful to understand commune or nada in a certain context, and remembering, we're keeping in mind that it should be something like commune independence or nothing. Keep bringing in the question of independence, bringing in the question of sovereignty. And I think you can inflect the slogan that way. It's interesting that when Chavez developed the slogan, he was riffing on Bolivar's independence or nothing. He had recently learned that Chavez was a great student of Bolivar's in so many senses, but he also literally investigated Bolivar's life. And apparently in that summer, it had come to his attention, or it was the spring actually, it had come to that slogan of Bolivar's, independence or nothing, independencia o nada, had come to his attention, and he was very surprised that there was a slogan of Bolivar's he didn't know. And that's, he changed that slogan from independencia o nada to commune o nada. But I think if we listen to commune o nada and we understand that on the side of commune is independencia, and we have to struggle to maintain it, that's how I would modify the slogan to bring it up to the present moment. I do think that the commune has an important role in anti-imperialist struggle or communal-like structures. When I was thinking about in this crisis, I would call it a crisis of imperialist attack. I went back to some of the original observations about the Bolivarian process, and I was reminded how Steve Elner talked about it from above and from below perspective. And I think that simple schema explains a lot about the Bolivarian process. The Bolivarian process always advanced from the state, unlike Zapatismo, it managed to take the state and have a transformed state power, and it also advanced from below with different structures. In the beginning, there were different kinds of organization. And I see that one of the most important, there are two elements of genius in this kind of viewpoint that I associate with the Bolivarian process. One is the from above and from below perspectives, realizing that both are important in an anti-imperialist project. But at the same time, a constant experimentation to find how to kind of conjugate those, find organizational forms. And I see the Commune as one of those organizational forms. First there were Mesas Técnicas de Agua, there were Comités de Tierra Urbana, and then the Community Council, and then the Commune. So I think this, because to make good on that relation, you need to institutionalize in some way. And I think the Commune is a brilliant effort to conjugate those two forms of power. And that goes back to, the question of how to defend yourself. I think when you look back at process of national liberation, often they were weakened by their inability to keep the grassroots and the state in that dialectical relationship. And in that same interview with people who find the interview with Angel Prado, where he insists on the need to, insists on the anti-imperialist dimension of the Commune, he also makes a nod to Syria. And he hints at the idea that the Syrian government fell because it had not managed to kind of incorporate the bases in its project sufficiently. But, it's far be it from me to be able to make that critique with any substantial information. But I do think that's been an ongoing challenge that process of national liberation face, is the effort to, how do you incorporate the masses over the long run in the project? How are they participants in the project? And I think we can see the Commune, as with the earlier organizational forms, as one of the efforts, and a highly successful effort, which has great potential to maintain that relationship between the state and the people, and to keep those two perspectives, those two necessary elements of an anti-imperialist struggle operating in a kind of coordination.
And for those of you who are curious to hear more about the evolution from these councils to the communes and the rest of it, I invite everybody to check out our previous episode with you, Chris, here on the Venezuelan Analysis podcast. And I think I'm definitely going to steal that from you now. It's comunas, soberanía o nada. It's communes, sovereignty, or nothing. And it's quite interesting because it's almost like a perfect little package in the sense that you cannot have a commune without sovereignty. And you cannot have sovereignty without these structures as well, be they communes or whatever form they take. And so I think we can wrap up with this final question here around sort of the broader implications of everything that you've studied in this issue, everything that you've done with communes in Venezuela, which is what are some of the implications beyond Venezuela for Latin America and the world? Obviously, we know that there is a certain tendency to want to find the recipe, and that's not what I'm aiming at, but certainly the kinds of things that we can go from the particular to the general to help us conceive of what the struggle looked like in the year 2025 as we face an ever more aggressive imperialism, but also an ever more present need to find that emancipation for all the peoples of the world.
Well, I'm going to go back to something that I was saying earlier. And that's that because we have these, we have been privileged really to be able to work, not only to be part of a commune in my case, but also to work, both Chris and I, with different communes. We actually have seen it firsthand, and we have seen dozens of communes with which we have worked over a period of time. In the building, with all their contradictions, because communes are building, they are not the heaven. Like communes, to build a commune, it requires a lot of work and actually a lot of sacrifice. So it doesn't happen overnight. We make mistakes as we build communes, we advance, and then all of a sudden, in my commune, for instance, we had the means of production that was very important, and then with the blockade, the pandemic, etc., all of a sudden we couldn't sustain it, and this was a serious setback for us. So I think that we should make it clear that there's a long way to go. Also, as I was saying before, communes should have communal property, because communes are not just there to have nice assemblies. They are actually to build a new society, a just society, not based on exploitation and domination. So, and most communes actually do not have communal property or social property, and that's something that as the communal movement we have to struggle it commune by commune, of course, but it also has to be a national exercise to struggle so that all communes have a means of production. That's something that we have to dispute with the government. This is a country under siege and the resources are limited, but there's still an oil rent, and we think I think that I cannot speak for the whole movement, but I can speak for my commune in this sense, specifically in this sense. I mean, I think we are committed to growing in terms of the productive capacities, the non-exploitative productive capacities of communes, and for that the government has to do more. I mean, there has to be transfer of resources to the communes so that communes can actually grow their means of production. That's still a pending task. The government has turned towards the commune over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, and especially over the past 2 years, and that's really very important. But that's not enough, and it's on us, frankly, to fight for it, so that the government will deliver the resources that we need to develop our means of production. So I wanted to put that kind of like to frame it, because sometimes when we talk about communes, we are very happy, we are very excited, we see that there's something really beautiful going on in Venezuela, and we try to transmit that too, but we also have to contextualize it. So that on the one hand, but actually your question was a much larger question, and that's where I'm going to go back to something that I was saying earlier. Well, in the global south, but the global working class, we all live exploitation, domination, and oppression. I will say, especially in the global south, of course, the exploitation, oppression, and domination is intensified, but it's a characteristic of the whole working class, and that's what unites us in the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. Because we have been privileged to visit and to be with many of these communes, we have seen really that the impact of the blockade, and in general the impact of capitalism in the global south country in the communes is much less. I mean, there were times when, around 2019, 2020, with the pandemic, people were dying and people didn't have the resources. I'm talking about working class people, didn't have the money even to bury their loved ones. I mean, very, very tragic things happened. And it was in territories where the communes were more consolidated. It was the surplus from some of the means of productions, or yes, the economic surplus from the means of productions, that actually was put at the service of solving these urgent matters for the people. And because it's not just here in Venezuela, but it happens around the world, and especially in the global south, that people find themselves in very tragic situations. I can say that from first hand, and having lived a very hard times in Venezuela, I can see that the communists are able to give answers to the immediate problems that we face. But communists are not only about giving answers to the immediate solutions to the immediate problems that we face, but they are about building a new society. We have a lot to learn from real socialism, from East Bloc socialism, but the truth is that it collapsed. So we have a lot to learn from the practices in terms of environmental practices, for instance, which is something that's addressed in one of the articles in this monthly review issue. But the fact is that it collapsed. The thesis or the hypothesis that Mesaros, the Hungarian philosopher, delivers is that it was because the metabolism of capital, the authoritarian and despotic forms that are proper to capitalism. So capitalism, of course, is based on wage exploitation, but then it comes with other forms of oppression and domination, and that's what he calls the metabolism of capital. So while there ceased to be wage labor, so there was no exploitation, there was no private property, and there was basically pretty much no bourgeoisie, actually these forms that are kind of like core to capitalism remained there. And that's where the proposal for the communes, for the communal model comes from Mesaros to Chavez, but also it comes from our history, from the history of the Venezuelan people who actually have elements of communalism that exist. And actually, that's not just only in Venezuela. In all societies, there are going to be communal elements that are important in terms of making the future socialist and communal a society if the people choose to go in the communal way. So that's how I would kind of like wrap it up. For those reasons, those are the reasons why I think the communal project, which is not exclusive to Venezuela, is actually important for all the working people of the world.
So, of course, we've been talking with Chris Gilbert, Cira Pascual Marquina, about the latest issue of Monthly Review, July-August 2025, Volume 77, Number 3, which was edited by Cira and Chris around the question of the communes. A very interesting global look at this. Before we say goodbye, Chris, I want to give you one last chance here to give us some parting words for our viewers and listeners here on the Venezuela Analysis podcast.
Sure, I wanted to say something inspired by the fact that you were saying that we're in a moment of a very urgent situation globally, and there's a need to learn. But I think that obviously the real revolutionary force is in the moment in the global South. And this produces a huge contradiction because so much of intellectual production, the means of intellectual production are overwhelmingly in the global North. And they fail to engage with those projects. To say they fail to engage is actually too generous. I often think they don't want to engage. So I think that one of the most important things is simply, I'm not so arrogant as to say do what we've done, but do what we've tried to do. I mean, I feel that we've tried to engage with the revolutionary process. And that is a revolutionary process in the global South. And that kind of work is extremely important. It's this engaging with the main founts of revolutionary struggle, whether they're in West Asia and China. This is the kind of work that Marx did in his lifetime, because one of the main, the workers' movement in Britain and Europe was extremely powerful one in his time, and he organized the First International. And perhaps the most impressive example of that is Lenin. I mean, Lenin created a huge body of work. It seems like he wrote almost every day, but all that work was an effort to understand a revolutionary process taking place with its epicenter in Russia at the time, but also globally. So that aspect of theory and that aspect of Marxism has kind of been pushed by the wayside towards efforts that I would call not only Eurocentric, but also idealist. People tend to hold up Marx. It's terrible, actually. They hold up Marx as some theory, some tablets, 10 commandments, and they say this project is bad because it doesn't conform to commandment number 8. Rather than I do believe that Marxism, as with any theory, has a critical element. It can be used to criticize what exists. Otherwise, you'd be in some mode in which you say everything that exists, all the rational is real, or everything that exists is good. Of course, there's a critical moment in Marxism, but Marxism also has to be a process of learning from experience, or as Lenin would say, a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And that has been pushed by the wayside. So I feel that in this crisis that you pointed to, there's an overwhelming need on the part to engage with actual revolutionary struggles and learn from them in an often humble way. But that humble way is the very way that Lenin and Marx did in their lifetimes. So that's what we've tried to do. That's what I hope to continue to do better. And I'd like to encourage other people, other researchers, investigators to do the same.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. I likewise invite everybody to check out the work of Chris and Cira in this latest issue of Monthly Review, but of course also the Venezuela Analysis website, where we cover news and analysis about Venezuela, close to these revolutionary forces, close to the grassroots, always trying to uplift these processes. So as to enlighten the rest, I know that that's a struggle that I engage with almost on a daily basis myself, of trying to get people to pay attention to what's happening in the global South. It's very much worth the effort. And I think we've said it many times here on this program, the urgency of it is demonstrably clear. I think never has it been more clear, at least in my lifetime, in terms of why it's so necessary to be asking these questions. And even, yes, to provide criticism where necessary, to take us to the places we need to be, in places like Mexico, Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, in order to not allow imperialism to destroy everything that we have built, precisely. Thank you again. As always, it's been a pleasure. Cira, Chris, We'll see you next time, I'm sure, at another future program of the Venezuela Analysis Podcast. Visit us at venezuelanalysis.com. And of course, give us a like, subscribe, share with your friends. It helps us out. Get more people to listen to precisely these kinds of conversations. The world is at stake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose Luis. Always a pleasure.